Maybe you can think of something else, and I wish you luck. Here, then, in no special order, are my bedwords based on SGRA. Puss-grapple. A bickering or minor disturbance, an argument or dispute among effeminate men. Also, less frequently, a physical struggle between or among women. Kiss granny. 1. A man who seeks the company of older women, especially older women with money. A designing fellow, a fortune hunter. 2. An over-affectionate old woman, a hug-moppet, a bunny talker. Glass grabber. 1. A woman who disapproves of or interferes with her husband's drinking. A killjoy, a slush laugh, a douse light. 2. A man who asks for another drink at a friend's house or goes out and gets one in the kitchen. Bless gravy. A minister or cleric, the head of a family, one who says grace, not to be confused with praise gravy, one who extols a woman's cooking, especially the cooking of a friend's wife. A gay fellow, a flirt, a seducer. Colloquial, a break vow, a shrug holy. Cuss gravy. A husband who complains of his wife's cooking, more especially a husband who complains of his wife's cooking in the presence of guests. An ill-tempered fellow, a curmudgeon, also sometimes a peptic ulcer case. Mess granter. An untidy housekeeper, a careless housewife, said of a woman who admits often proudly that she has let herself go, a bragdowdy, a frumpus. Hiss grammar. An illiterate fellow, a user of slovenly rhetoric, a father who disapproves of book learning, also more rarely one who lisps, a twist tongue. Chorus grable. Originally a young actress, overconfident of her ability and her future, a snippet, a flapperty-gibbet. Derivation, Betty Grable, an American movie actress. Press grape. One who presses grapes, a grape presser. Less commonly, a crunchberry. Press grain. 1. A man who tries to make whiskey in his own cellar, hence a secret drinker, a hide bottle, a sneak slug. 2. One who presses grain in a grain presser, archaic. Dress grader. A woman who stares another woman up and down, a stare frock, hence a rude female, a hobbledehoyden. Fuss grape. 1. One who diets or toys with his food, a light eater. A person without appetite, a scorn muffin, a shun cabbage. 2. A man, usually American, who boasts of his knowledge of wines, a smug bottle. Bass grave. 1. Cold-eyed, unemotional, stolid, trout solemn. 2. The grave of a bass, obscure. Lass graphic. Of or pertaining to the vivid description of females. As the guest was so lass graphic, his host asked him to change the subject or get out. Also said of fathers of daughters, more rarely of mothers. Bliss grave. Aged by marriage. Also sometimes discouraged by wedlock or by the institution of marriage. Glass grail, a large nocturnal moth, not to be confused with smack window, the common June bug, or bang sash. Hoss grace, innate or native dignity, similar to that of the thoroughbred hoss, southern U.S. Bus granite, literally a stone kisser, a man who persists in trying to win the favor or attention of cold, indifferent, or capricious women, not to be confused with snatch kiss, a kitchen lover. Toss gravel. 1. A male human being who tosses gravel, usually at night, at the window of a female human being's bedroom, usually that of a young virgin. Hence, a lover, a male sweetheart, and an eloper. 2. One who is suspected by the father of a daughter of planning an elopement with her, a grab lass. If you should ever get into a game of super ghosts with Mitchell, by the way, don't pass B-U-G-L on to him, hoping to send him into bugling. He will simply add an O, making the group Buglow, which is 5/7 of bugloss. The word means hawkweed, and you can see what Mitchell would do if you handed him AWKW, expecting to make him continue the spelling of awkward. Tough guy, Mitchell. Tough game, super ghosts. You take it from here. I'm tired. The Whip-Poor-Will. The night had just begun to get pale around the edges when the Whip-Poor-Will began. Kinstry, who slept in a back room on the 4th floor, facing the meadow and the strip of woods beyond, heard a blind man tapping and a bugle calling and a woman screaming, "Help! Police!" The sergeant in gray was cutting open envelopes with a sword. "Sit down there! Sit down there! Sit down there!" he chanted at Kinstry. "Sit down there! Cut your throat! Cut your throat! Whippoorwill! Whippoorwill! Whippoorwill!" And Kinstry woke up. He opened his eyes, but lay without moving for several minutes, separating the fantastic morning from the sounds and symbols of his dream. There was the palest wash of light in the room. Kinstry scowled through tousled hair at his wristwatch and saw that it was 10 minutes past 4. Whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will. The bird sounded very near in the grass outside the window, perhaps. Kinstry got up and went to the window in his bare feet and looked out. You couldn't tell where the thing was. The sound was all around you, incredibly loud and compelling and penetrating. Kinstry had never heard a whippoorwill so near at hand before. He had heard them as a boy in Ohio, in the country, but he remembered their call as faint and plaintive and far away, dying before long somewhere between the hills and the horizon. You didn't hear the bird often in Ohio, it came back to him, and it almost never ventured as close to a house or barn as this brazen-breasted bird, murdering sleep out there along the fence line somewhere. Whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will. Kinstry climbed back into bed and began to count. The bird did 27 whips without pausing. His lungs must be built like a pelican's pouch, or a puffin, or a penguin, or a pemmican, or a paladin. It was bright daylight when Kinstry fell asleep again. At breakfast, Madge Kinstry, looking cool and well-rested in her white piqué housecoat, poured the coffee with steady authority. She raised her eyebrows slightly in mild surprise when Kinstry mentioned the whip-poor-will the second time. She had not listened the first time, for she was lost in exploring, with a long, sensitive finger, an infinitesimal chip on the rim of her coffee cup. "Whip-poor-will?" she said finally. "No, I didn't hear it. Of course, my room is on the front of the house. You must have been slept out and ready to wake up anyway, or you wouldn't have heard it." "Ready to wake up?" said Kinstry. "At 4 o'clock in the morning? I hadn't slept 3 hours." "Well, I didn't hear it," said Mrs. Kinstry. "I don't listen for night noises. I don't even hear the crickets or the frogs." "Neither do I," said Kinstry. "It's not the same thing. This thing is loud as a fire bell. You can hear it for a mile." "I didn't hear it," she said, buttering a piece of thin toast. Kinstry gave it up and turned his scowling attention to the headlines in the Herald Tribune of the day before. The vision of his wife sleeping quietly in her canopied four-poster came between his eyes and the ominous headlines. Madge always slept quietly, almost without moving, her arms straight and still outside the covers, her fingers relaxed. She did not believe anyone had to toss and turn. "It's a notion," she would tell Kinstry. "Don't let your nerves get the best of you. Use your willpower." "Mm-hmm," said Kinstry aloud, not meaning to. "Yes, sir," said Arthur, the Kinstry's colored butler, offering Kinstry a plate of hot blueberry muffins. "Nothing," said Kinstry, looking at his wife. "Did you hear the whippoorwill, Arthur?" "No, sir, I didn't," said Arthur. "Did Margaret?" "I don't think she did, sir," said Arthur. "She didn't say anything about it." The next morning the whippoorwill began again at the same hour, rolling out its loops and circles of sound across the new day. Kinstry, in his dreams, was beset by trios of little bearded men rolling hoops at him. He tried to climb up onto a gigantic Ferris wheel whose swinging seats were rumpled beds. The round cop with wheels for feet rolled toward him, shouting, "Will Power Will, Will Power Will, Whip-poor-will." Kinstry opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling and began to count the whips. At one point, the bird did 53 straight without pausing. I suppose, like the drops of water or the bright light in the third degree, this could drive you nuts, Kinstry thought, or make you confess. He began to think of things he hadn't thought of for years. The time he took the quarter from his mother's pocketbook. The time he steamed open a letter addressed to his father. It was from his teacher in the 8th grade. Miss Wilpool, Miss Whippoor, Miss Willpower, Miss Wilmot, that was it. He had reached the indiscretions of his middle 20s when the whippoorwill suddenly stopped on poor, not on will. Something must have frightened it. Kinstry sat up on the edge of the bed and lighted a cigarette and listened. The bird was through calling all right, but Kinstry couldn't go back to sleep. The day was as bright as a flag. He got up and dressed. "I thought you weren't going to smoke cigarettes before breakfast anymore," said Madge later. "I found 4 stubs in the ashtray in your bedroom." It was no use telling her he had smoked them before going to bed. You couldn't fool Madge. She always knew. "That goddamn bird woke me up again," he said, "and this time I couldn't get back to sleep." He passed her his empty coffee cup. "It did 53 without stopping this morning," he added. "I don't know how the hell it breathes." His wife took his coffee cup and set it down firmly. "Not 3 cups," she said, "not with you sleeping so restlessly the way it is." "You didn't hear it, I suppose," he said. She poured herself some more coffee. "No," she said, "I didn't hear it." Margaret hadn't heard it either, but Arthur had. Kinstry talked to them in the kitchen while they were cleaning up after breakfast. Arthur said that it woke him, but he went right back to sleep. He said he slept like a log, must be the air off the ocean. As for Margaret, she always slept like a log. Only thing ever kept her awake was people a-hoopin' and a-hollerin'. She was glad she didn't hear the whippoorwill. Down where she came from, she said, if you heard a whippoorwill singing near the house, it meant there was going to be a death. Arthur said he had heard about that, too. Must have been his grandma told him or somebody. If a whippoorwill singing near the house meant death, Kinstry told them, it wouldn't really make any difference whether you heard it or not. It doesn't make any difference whether you see the ladder you're walking under, he said, lighting a cigarette and watching the effect of his words on Margaret. She turned from putting some plates away, and her eyes widened and rolled a little. "Mr. Kinstry is just teasing you, Mag," said Arthur, who smiled and was not afraid. "Thinks he's pretty smart," Kinstry thought. Just a little bit too smart, maybe. Kinstry remembered Arthur's way of smiling almost imperceptibly at things Mrs. Kinstry sometimes said to her husband when Arthur was just coming into the room or just going out, little things that were none of his business to listen to, like, "Not 3 cups of coffee if a bird keeps you awake." Wasn't that what she had said? "Is there any more coffee?" he asked testily, "or did you throw it out?" He knew they had thrown it out. Breakfast had been over almost an hour. "We can make you some fresh," said Arthur. "Never mind," said Kinstry. "Just don't be so sure of yourself. There's nothing in life to be sure about." When, later in the morning, he started out the gate to walk down to the post office, Madge called to him from an upstairs window. "Where are you going?" she asked, amiably enough. He frowned up at her. "To the taxidermist's," he said, and went on. He realized, as he walked along in the warm sunlight, that he had made something of a spectacle of himself, just because he hadn't had enough sleep or enough coffee. It wasn't his fault, though. It was that infernal bird. He discovered after a quarter of a mile that the imperative rhythm of the whippoorwill's call was running through his mind, but the words of the song were new. Fatal bell, fatal bell, fatal bell. Now, where had that popped up from? It took him some time to place it. It was a fragment from Macbeth. There was something about the fatal bellman crying in the night. The fatal bellman cried the livelong night, something like that. It was an owl that cried the night Duncan was murdered. Funny thing to call up after all these years. He hadn't read the play since college. It was that fool Margaret talking about the whippoorwill and the old superstition that if you hear the whippoorwill singing near the house, it means there is going to be a death. Here it was, the middle of the 20th century, and people still believed in stuff like that. The next dawn, the dream induced by the calling of the whippoorwill was longer and more tortured, a nightmare filled with dark perils and heavy hopelessness. Kinstry woke up trying to call out. He lay there breathing hard and listening to the bird. He began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then suddenly he leaped out of bed and ran to the window and began yelling and pounding on the window pane and running the blind up and down. He shouted and cursed until his voice got hoarse. The bird kept right on going. He slammed the window down and turned away from it, and there was Arthur in the doorway. "What is it, Mr. Kinstry?" said Arthur. He was fumbling with the cord of a faded old bathrobe and trying to blink the sleep out of his eyes. "Is anything the matter?" Kinstry glared at him. "Get out of here," he shouted, "and put some coffee on, or get me a brandy or something." "I'll put some coffee on," said Arthur. He went shuffling away in his slippers, still half asleep. "Well," said Madge Kinstry over her coffee cup at breakfast, "I hope you got your tantrum over and done with this morning. I never heard such a spectacle, squalling like a spoiled brat." "You can't hear spectacles," said Kinstry coldly. "You see them." "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "No, you don't," thought Kinstry. "You never have, never have, never have, never have." Would he ever get that damned rhythm out of his head? It struck him that perhaps Madge had no subconscious. When she lay on her back, her eyes closed. When she got up, they opened like a doll's. The mechanism of her mind was as simple as a cigarette box. It was either open or it was closed, and there was nothing else, nothing else, nothing else. The whole problem turns on a very neat point, Kinstry thought as he lay awake that night, drumming on the headboard with his fingers. William James would have been interested in it. Henry, too, probably. I've got to ignore this thing, get adjusted to it, become oblivious of it. I mustn't fight it, I mustn't build it up. If I get to screaming at it, I'll be running across that wet grass out there in my bare feet, charging that bird as if it were a trench full of Germans, throwing rocks at it, giving the rebel yell or something, for God's sake. No, I mustn't build it up. I'll think of something else every time it pops into my mind. I'll name the old Cub infield to myself over and over. Steinfield to Tinker to Evers to Chance. Steinfield to Tinker to Evers. Kinstry did not succeed in becoming oblivious of the whippoorwill. Its dawn call pecked away at his dreams like a vulture at a heart. It slowly carved out a recurring nightmare in which Kinstry was attacked by an umbrella whose handle, when you clutched it, clutched right back. For the umbrella was not an umbrella at all, but a raven. Through the gloomy hallways of his mind rang the thing's dolorous cry, "Nevermore, nevermore, nevermore, whippoorwill, whippoorwill." One day Kinstry asked Mr. Tetford at the post office if the whippoorwills ever went away. Mr. Tetford squinted at him. "Don't look like the sun was browning you up none," he said. "I don't know as they ever go away. They move around. I like to hear 'em. You get used to 'em." "Sure," said Kinstry. "What do people do when they get used to them, though? I mean, old ladies or sick people." "Only one's been bothered was old Miss Purdy. She darn near set fire to the whole island, trying to burn 'em out of her woods. Shooting at 'em might drive 'em off, for a body could trap 'em easy enough and let 'em loose somewheres else. But people get used to 'em after a few mornings." "Oh, sure," said Kinstry. "Sure." That evening in the living room, when Arthur brought in the coffee, Kinstry's cup cackled idiotically in its saucer when he took it off the tray. Madge Kinstry laughed. "Your hand is shaking like a leaf," she said. He drank all his coffee at once and looked up savagely. "If I could get one good night's sleep, it might help," he said. "That damn bird, I'd like to wring its neck." "Oh, come now," she said mockingly. "You wouldn't hurt a fly. Remember the mouse we caught in the Westport house? You took it out in the field and let it go." "The trouble with you," he began and stopped. He opened the lid of a cigarette box and shut it, opened and shut it again reflectively. "As simple as that," he said. She dropped her amused smile and spoke shortly. "You're acting like a child about that silly bird," she said. "Worse than a child. I was over at the Barrys this afternoon. Even their little Anne didn't make such a fuss. A whippoorwill frightened her the first morning, but now she never notices them." "I'm not frightened, for God's sake," shouted Kinstry. "Frightened or brave, asleep or awake, open or shut, you make everything black or white." "Well," she said, "I like that." "I think the bird wakes you up, too," he said. "I think it wakes up Arthur and Margaret." "And we just pretend it doesn't?" she asked. "Why on earth should we?" "Oh, out of some fool notion of superiority, I suppose. Out of, I don't know." "I'll thank you not to class me with the servants," she said coldly. He lighted a cigarette and didn't say anything. "You're being ridiculous and childish," she said, "fussing about nothing at all, like an invalid in a wheelchair." He got up and started from the room. "Nothing at all," he said, watching her go. She turned at the door. "Ted Barry says he'll take you on at tennis if your bird hasn't worn you down too much." She went on up the stairs, and he heard her close the door of her room. He sat smoking moodily for a long time, and fell to wondering whether the man's wife in the Raven had seen what the man had seen, perched on the pallid bust of Pallas just above the chamber door. Probably not, he decided. When he went to bed, he lay awake a long while, trying to think of the last line of the Raven. He couldn't get any farther than, "like a demon that is dreaming." And this kept running through his head. "Nuts," he said at last, aloud, and he had the oddly disturbing feeling that it wasn't he who had spoken, but somebody else. Kinstray was not surprised that Madge was a little girl in pigtails and a play suit. The long gray hospital room was filled with poor men in wheelchairs, running with long, sensitive fingers around the rims of empty coffee cups. "Poor Will," chanted Madge, pointing her finger at him. "Here are your spectacles, here are your spectacles." One of the sick men was Arthur, grinning at him, and holding him with one hand, so that he was powerless to move his arms or legs. Hurt a fly," chanted Madge. Whip him now," she cried. And she was the umpoor in the high chair beside the court, holding a black umbrella over her head. "Love 30, love 40, 41, 42, 43, 44. His feet were stuck in the wet concrete on his side of the net, and Margaret peered over the net at him, holding a skillet for a racket. Arthur was pushing him down now, and he was caught in the concrete from head to foot. It was Madge, laughing and counting over him. "Refer 3, Refer 4, Refer 5, Refer Will, Repor Will, Whippor Will, Whippor Will, Whippor Will." The dream still clung to Kinstray's mind like a cobweb as he stood in the kitchen in his pajamas and bare feet, wondering what he wanted, what he was looking for. He turned on the cold water in the sink and filled a glass, but only took a sip and put it down. He left the water running. He opened the bread box and took out half a loaf, wrapped in oiled paper, and pulled open a drawer. He took out the bread knife, and then put it back and took out the long, sharp carving knife. He was standing there, holding the knife in one hand and the bread in the other, when the door to the dining room opened. It was Arthur. "Who do you do first?" Kinstray said to him hoarsely. The Barrys, on their way to the beach in their station wagon, drove into the driveway between the house and the barn. They were surprised to see that at 11:15 in the morning, the Kinstray servants hadn't taken in the milk. The bottle, standing on the small back porch, was hot to Barry's touch. When he couldn't rouse anyone, pounding and calling, he climbed up on the cellar door and looked in the kitchen window. He told his wife sharply to get back in the car. The local police and the state troopers were in and out of the house all day. It wasn't every morning in the year that you got called out on a triple murder and suicide. It was just getting dark when Troopers Baird and Lennon came out of the front door and walked down to their car, pulled up beside the road in front of the house. Out in back, probably in the little strip of wood there, Lennon figured, a whippoorwill began to call. Lennon listened a minute. "You ever hear the old people say a whippoorwill singing near the house means death?" he asked. Baird grunted and got in under the wheel. Lennon climbed in beside him. "Take more'n a whippoorwill to cause a mess like that," said Trooper Baird, starting the car. The Ordeal of Mr. Matthews. "The practice of wit as a fine art is one with the carriage horse and the dulcimer," I said to the businessman who got stuck with me at a party in the country one afternoon. The sounds of modern tea-time, gabble and loud laughter, drifted into the small study where I had found him sitting down over a back copy of Life. For one thing, I went on, the appointments, the accoutrements, the accessories have vanished like the snows of the famous ballad. My name is Matthews, he said, and shifted a glass of ale from his right hand to his left. We shook hands. Where now, Matthews, I demanded, are the long draperies, the bright chandeliers, the shining floors, the high ceilings, the snuff-box, the handkerchief stuck in the sleeve with careless care, the perfect bow from the waist, the formal but agile idiom? Set-up is different today, Matthews said. Gone, I told him, lost in the oblivious plangency of our darkening era, crumbled of their luster, save for a sparkle here, a twinkle there, in the remembered dust of the stately centuries. Matthews put the copy of Life on the floor and got up. Think I'll have some more of this ale, he said. To my surprise, he came back a minute later with an uncapped bottle and the dogged expression of a man determined to make out the meaning of voices heard dimly beyond a wall. The high tradition of wit in court and chancellery, I resumed, died, I suppose, with Joseph Choate. His weapon was a saber, not a rapier, but even the clangor of that bold steel did not linger in London town to inspire with its faraway echoes Walter Page and Joseph Kennedy. Lots of energy, Joe Kennedy, Matthews said. Tackle anything. Handle it well. Choate lived to see the lights diminish, the magnificence dwindle, and the men decline, I said. He saw the thrust lose its deftness until there was no longer need for skillful parry and riposte. The querulous and irritable then had their day, giving way in our land and time to the wisecrack and the gag, the leg pull and the hot foot, the gimmick and the switcheroo. Matthews grunted and sought sanctuary in the close examination of a cigar. For the exercise of wit in the grand manner, I told him, for the slash supreme, the stab sublime, or, if you prefer, Untermeyer, the devastating crusher, one has to go back to the golden age of John Wilkes and Benjamin Disraeli. Matthews lighted his cigar. What'd you say it was, Sam Untermeyer said? He asked. Not Sam, I said, Louis. A woman appeared at the door of the study. Have you seen Nora? Matthews asked her. She's in the dining room with Ed and Carl, having fun and laughs. Don't you want a drink, Mr. Thurber? I'm on the wagon, I said. Matthews looked at me as if he didn't believe it. The woman went away. Who was that? I asked. Our hostess, he said simply. He tried a sudden tack. Ed certainly brought that business of his up from nowhere. I quickly bypassed the looming discussion of Ed's acumen and went on talking. Both Wilkes and Disraeli enjoyed, of course, those unique advantages of decor and deportment which were so conducive and becoming to the brilliant verbal duel. Wilkes, for example, had that most superb of foils, that greatest straight man in the history of wit, Lord Sandwich, almost always at his side in resplendent assemblages. At one of these, with all the important ears in town cocked, Sandwich accosted Wilkes with, "You will die of a pox, sir, or on the gallows," to which Wilkes replied, "That depends, sir, on whether I embrace your mistress or your principles." Matthews turned his glass in his hand. Had 'em more openly in those days, of course, mistresses, he said. Disraeli also had the luck of the witty, I said. A lady once asked him at a reception if he could tell her the difference between a misfortune and a calamity. While all London listened, the great man replied, "If Mr. Gladstone were to fall into the Thames, it would be a misfortune. If someone pulled him out, it would be a calamity." Great deal of bickering among the English in those days, Matthews said. Still is, he added after a moment. I made an impatient gesture. The Disraeli woman, I went on, with her eager interest in definition, is extinct. The curiosity of the American woman, cabined and confined, rarely takes provocative or a stimulating shape. It is all but impossible, for instance, to conceive of a lady upping to swope, say, at the bar in 21, with a question calculated to evoke an immortal reply. For one thing, the cramped and noisy setting is distinctly unpropitious, since it is far removed indeed from the resplendent assemblage, with its gracious and convenient lulls in conversation. One would have to say to our hypothetical lady, "How's that?" or "I beg your pardon," and the precise timing so essential to the great retort would be irreparably ruined. A woman came into the study with a cocktail in her hand. "Don't you think we ought to be getting along, Nora?" Matthews asked. "Nonsense," she said. "It's early." "This is Mr. Thurber," he told her. "My wife." I stood up. "Mr. Thurber has been telling a story about Gerard Swope." "Not Gerard," I said. "Herbert Bayard." "Oh," said Matthews. "That's nice," said his wife, and she went away. "Only yesterday," I said, sitting down, "my secretary straightened up the room I work in. And an imposing task it was, to be sure. She separated answered and unanswered mail, soiled handkerchiefs and telegrams, dog drawings and razor blades, and in the process she came up with a folder of news clippings marked, 'Things You Said.'" "Things you said yourself, eh?" Matthew's eyes narrowed a little. "Well, so the record shows," I sighed. "It all supports our theory of the changing setup. The deterioration of the players and the scene. The passing of the ancient glories. I have the contents of the folder fairly well in mind. They're skimpy enough, God knows. The first item is a clipping from the Chicago Sun. "Field," said Matthews, "big operator." It seems that Freddie Wakeman, the millionaire novelist, told the Sun's Spektorsky an anecdote about me when I was in Bermuda. A dewy young thing came up to me in a bar in Somerset, the story goes, and asked me why I had sold a certain piece of mine to the movies. Quick as a flash, I answered, "Money. "Government probably got most of it," Matthews said. The man was beginning to make me nervous. "The point is not in the financial transaction itself," I said testily. "The point is in the payoff at the bar down there in Somerset. I spelled it out. There is no surer way to blunt the crusher and destroy the devastation." "You don't have any recollection of the incident, eh?" Matthews asked shrewdly. "None," I said. Of course, I was 51 at the time, and perhaps a little cockeyed. If I spelled out the payoff, it is an indictment of my slowing mind, or a proof of my decrepitude. Matthews sat forward in his chair as if poised for flight. "How big a folder'd you say this was?" he asked. "Sparse," I snapped. "It won't detain you long. Why don't you get some more ale?" "I believe I will," he said, and went away. When Matthews came back, I began again. "Well, it seems I came out of this movie theater with a group of friends. I always attend the cinema in the bosom of my circle. And one of them said, 'I think that picture stinks,' to which I instantly replied, 'I didn't think it was that good.' I got out a cigarette and lighted it. "My wife and daughter are crazy about this James Mason," Matthews said. The anecdote limps so obviously that I feel myself now and then attempting to repair or recap it, I went on. "Like this, for example. If a picture worse than stinks," put in Louis Sobel, who was also there, "metrofaction may be said to have set in." "What was that?" asked Matthews. I exhaled slowly. "Nothing," I said. "But if you have already been blinded by the brilliance, shade your mental eyes against what is still to come. In the summer of 1946, some months after the movie episode, a sensitive Time reporter got me on the long-distance phone to chat about the ICC. He said, 'Do you know Joe Davidson?' 'No,' said Matthews, 'I don't.' The reporter asked me that," I snarled. "The files of Time, forever antic and forever wrong, reveal that I shot back, 'I met him once, he has a beard.'" Matthews shifted his glass to his left hand and adjusted his tie. "The Time man omitted to report, for some obscure reason, that I thought Mr. Davidson was head of the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's too bad, because Time men and Tie women, in fact the whole loose empire, would still be laughing." "Never miss an issue of Time if I can help it," Matthews said. As keen as my famous Davidson quip was, I said I was to top it in that same remarkable year. A few months later, Earl Wilson, the sympathetic columnist of the New York Post, called on me at my office in the city. When he came in, I was drinking black coffee. My greeting was what I can only describe as a staggeroo. "I'm having some formaldehyde," I'm supposed to have said. "Will you join me?" Matthews took out another cigar and gave it a squirrelly inspection. "Well, sir, to get on with the folder," I began again, It seems that I came out of a movie theater last July after seeing a picture based rather insecurely on a piece I wrote years ago. On this occasion, the story goes, I emerged in the company of a distinguished group of New York cognoscenti. Did anybody catch the name of that picture? I asked drolly. Bennett Cerf, a wit in his own right and in several other persons, printed my comment in his column. The town is still chuckling. Matthews lighted his cigar and seemed to be trying to hide behind it. The most recent, and you will be glad to hear the final item in the folder, I said, appeared in an issue of the Hollywood Reporter. I think I can quote it exactly. Mine, that is, favorite line about Hollywood is, look what they did to Maurice Costello. I take it that one repeats one's favorite line as one rereads one's favorite book. The appalling thought has occurred to me that at some party or other I may have repeated the line several times to the same person. I wonder that no one has shouted at me, will you, for the love of God, stop saying that? What's going on in here? Are you two fighting? It was Nora back again with a fresh cocktail. No, I said, you overheard an inner quote. Some woman yelled at him at a party, Matthews explained. The wretch, cried Nora. We must be charitable, I said. After all, she had been through a lot. Nora, don't you think, Matthews began. It's the shank of the afternoon, she said, and left the room. Matthews finished his ale and puffed at his cigar. He was getting fidgety. So endeth, I sighed, the paltry, the pathetic folder. Matthew's elbows seemed about to lift him out of his chair, but he relaxed when I began again. One of my colleagues is reported to have watched on a Long Island estate the transplanting of a great elm. This little job, his host told him, is costing me $200,000. Shows what God could do if he had money, my friend commented. He modestly disclaims the observation, but the point I want to make is this. If it had been hung on me, the story would go, this little job is costing me $200,000. That, remarked Thurber, is a lot of money. I resent Matthews, I added angrily. What has all the appearance of a conspiracy to place on my shoulders the mantle of Calvin Coolidge? Matthews frowned for a long moment. Things you really said never got printed, eh? He shrewdly inquired. I laughed modestly and put on an expression of feigned embarrassment. Well, they don't exactly ripple off my tongue, I said. I'm no Jack Warner. But as a matter of fact, since you ask, there was one. This happened, 15 years ago. I had completely forgotten about it until something reminded me of it about 6 months ago. A tall, thin, serious-looking man came into the reception room of the magazine I worked for and asked for me. He told me he represented a publisher of high-priced special editions. He said his firm had hit on the idea of having me do new illustrations for Alice in Wonderland. I said, let's keep the 10-year drawings and I'll rewrite the story. The chap bowed and went away. Matthews scowled. Fellow thought you were an artist instead of a writer, eh? He brought out finally. Precisely, I said. Well, as it happened, there was no one but this man and me in the reception room at the time. I never have any luck that way. However, I sauntered into the office of a colleague and told him what I had said. Weeks went by, then months and years, but no one ever spoke to me about the incident. My colleague, absorbed with some problem of his own, had apparently not listened to what I told him. The tall, thin man obviously never repeated the bit of dialogue either. Turned down, probably disappointed, said Matthews. When I was reminded of the incident 6 months ago, I went on, I told it to a writer friend of mine. He put it in the first act of a play he was writing, giving me credit by name and retelling the story perfectly. What play was that? Asked Matthews. It was never produced, I said. Matthews pushed himself up out of his chair, mumbled something about having to see Ed, and walked away, swiftly, I thought, for a man of his bulk. He had pretty well worn me out. A middle-aged woman flounced into the room and sat down in the chair he had left. What do you know about Putney? She yelped. Everything, I lied, hastily, but it was no good. She told me about Putney until it was time to leave. Another woman came up to me before I could find my hostess or my hat. John Matthews has been telling us a perfectly wonderful story, Mr. Thurber, she squealed. about how you absolutely refused to rewrite Alice in Wonderland, in spite of all the money they offered you." "Moola," I said coldly. "Well, I think it was perfectly wonderful of you. I really do." "It was nothing at all," I said. "Anybody would have done the same thing." She shrieked, "You're much too modest, Mr. Thurber, really." "I'm not modest, madam," I snarled. "I'm simply too Goddamn unlucky for words." I felt my wife's firm, familiar grip on my arm. "Come on," she said. "It's time to go. I said goodbye to Harriet for you." She found my hat, and we went out and got in the car. "What were you shouting at Ida Barlow for?" she asked, starting the engine. "Madam," I said, "if a man shouts at Ida Barlow, he makes an ass of her. But if he does not shout at Ida Barlow, he makes an ass of himself. Ask me anything, and I'll give you a comeback." "How did you manage not to fall off the wagon?" she asked. "I was sure you were going to when I saw you were stuck with John Matthews." "Putney, anything else would have been as bad," I said. She glanced at me with a hint of concern. "Ask me why I didn't fall off the wagon," I demanded. She sighed. "All right, why didn't you fall off the wagon?" "They didn't have any formaldehyde," I chortled. It didn't strike her as funny for some reason, but I had to laugh. I laughed most of the way home. Lavender with a difference. Belinda Wolfe telephoned my mother at the Southern Hotel in Columbus one morning 10 years ago and apologized in a faintly familiar voice for never having run in to call on her. Something always seemed to turn up, she declared, to keep her from dropping by for a visit, and she was sorry. "I've thought of you, Mrs. Thurber," said Belinda. "I've thought of you every day since I worked for you on Champion Avenue. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" It certainly had. Belinda Wolfe was only 23 years old when she came to work for us as cook in the spring of 1899, and she was 73 when she finally got around to calling her former employer. Half a century had gone by since my mother had heard her voice. Belinda had thought of telephoning for more than 18,000 days, but, as she indicated, more than 18,000 things had turned up to prevent her. About a year after Belinda's appearance out of the past, I went to Columbus, and my mother and I drove out to see her. She was then the wife of Joe Barlow, master carpenter of the Neal House, where Charles Dickens used to stay during his Western trips 100 years ago. In 50 years, Belinda had not wandered very far. She was living only 2 blocks from our old house on South Champion Avenue. The weather was warm, and we sat on the veranda and talked about a night in 1899 that we all remembered. It was past midnight, according to an old clock in the attic of my memory, when Belinda suddenly flung open a window of her bedroom and fired 2 shots from a .32 caliber revolver at the shadowy figure of a man skulking about in our backyard. Belinda's shooting frightened off the prowler and aroused the family. I was 5 years old, going on 6 at the time, and I had thought that only soldiers and policemen were allowed to have guns. From then on, I stood in awe, but not in fear, of the lady who kept a revolver under her pillow. "It was a lonesome place, wasn't it?" said Belinda with a sigh, "way out there at the end of nowhere." We sat for a while without talking, thinking about the lonesome place at the end of nowhere. Number 921 South Champion Avenue is just another house now in a long row of houses, but when we lived there in 1899 and 1900, it was the last house on the street. Just south of us, the avenue dwindled to a wood road that led into a thick grove of oak and walnut trees, long since destroyed by the southward march of asphalt. Our nearest neighbor on the north was 50 yards away, and across from us was a country meadow that ticked with crickets in the summertime and turned yellow with goldenrod in the fall. Lying on the edge of town, we rarely heard footsteps at night or carriage wheels, but the darkness in every season was deepened by the lonely sound of locomotive whistles.